time I did that, the first time that you just saw, I went back there and went, what came over me? Who am I?
Then, in a moment of unfiltered honesty, Sally revealed what no one ever expected. The 9 men she secretly wanted to sleep with. Not just crushes, not just harmless daydreams, but raw, undeniable longing for some of the most famous men Hollywood has ever known. And she didn't stop at 1 or 2 names. She went further, confessing that her list ran deeper than anyone imagined. Tonight, we pull back the curtain on Sally Field's most shocking confession and the 9 men who haunted her fantasies. For more than half a century, Sally Field has been one of the most beloved actresses in America. She broke into television as the sun-kissed surfer girl in Gidget, and then won hearts as the spunky flying nun. But what made Sally different from so many others was her ability to grow past the roles that defined her early career. By the late 1970s, she had transformed herself into a powerhouse, winning Oscars for Norma Ray and Places in the Heart. Audiences admired her grit, her vulnerability, and her endless authenticity. She wasn't just an actress, she was a symbol of perseverance and heart, and that's why her recent revelation hit with such shock. Hollywood veterans rarely speak so openly about desire. Even now, in an era when stars confess their most intimate truths on podcasts and social media, hearing someone like Sally Field, someone known for her dignity, her elegance, her warmth, speak so bluntly about the men she longed for, feels almost revolutionary. For decades, Sally kept this side of herself hidden. She was careful, private, and even shy when it came to her love life. Fans knew about her relationship with Burt Reynolds, but the rest of her romantic history remained largely off-limits. And yet, here she was at 78, dropping names that made jaws drop across Hollywood. This wasn't gossip. It wasn't a rumor. These were her own words. Sally wasn't whispering in the shadows. She was saying it plainly, almost mischievously, like someone finally tired of playing the polite game. It matters because in that moment, Sally Field reminded the world that women don't stop desiring, don't stop fantasizing, just because they get older. She gave a voice to what so many others feel, but never say. And in doing so, she shattered the image of herself as just the sweet girl next door. She became something more, a woman unapologetically honest about longing. Of all the men Sally named, James Garner may have been the least surprising, and yet the most revealing. She starred opposite him in the 1985 romantic comedy Murphy's Romance, and their chemistry was impossible to ignore. On screen, he was the charming older man with a gentle smile and a mischievous twinkle in his eye. Off-screen, Sally admitted that his warmth and quiet masculinity nearly drove her to cross a line. She once confessed she almost dragged him off set. It wasn't just his looks, though they were undeniable. It was the way he carried himself, polite, respectful, but with an undercurrent of danger. Garner was the kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice or make bold moves to seduce. He simply existed, and women, Sally included, leaned in closer. Audiences loved their banter in Murphy's Romance. Every glance, every smile seemed to suggest something deeper, something unscripted. Fans wondered if the attraction was real. According to Sally, it was. Garner wasn't just a co-star, he was tempted in cowboy boots. And though she never acted on it, she admitted the pull was so strong, it almost scared her. James Garner represented the archetype of the gentleman outlaw. He wasn't a bad boy in the traditional sense. He wasn't reckless or cruel. Instead, he had that rare mix of kindness and danger. A man who could make you laugh, make you feel safe, and still leave you wondering what he'd do if you let him get too close. For Sally Field, resisting James Garner wasn't just difficult, it was one of the hardest acts of self-control she ever had to perform. If James Garner was the gentleman outlaw, then Burt Reynolds was pure temptation, wild, reckless, and impossible to resist. Sally Field didn't just work with him. She fell into one of Hollywood's most talked-about romances with him after they starred together in Smokey and the Bandit in 1977. Their chemistry was electric, so undeniable that even decades later people still talk about it. On screen, Burt's mustache, laughter, and teasing magnetism created a character that every man wanted to be and every woman wanted to be with. Off-screen, it wasn't all that different. Sally admitted she couldn't always tell where the acting ended and the desire began. He had this energy, she once explained. It was like trying to keep your balance in a storm. You couldn't help but be pulled into it. Their relationship was messy, passionate, and unforgettable. The tabloids hinted at a love affair bigger than anything the cameras captured. And for once, the tabloids weren't exaggerating. Bert was the rogue, the bad boy who knew exactly how to break the rules and make you thank him for it. Sally confessed that even when their relationship was complicated, even when it hurt, she still couldn't help but be drawn back to him. For many fans, Bert and Sally were the Hollywood couple of the late 70s. Fast cars, fast love, fast heartbreak. And though their romance eventually collapsed under the weight of its own intensity, Sally's confession makes one thing clear: Burt Reynolds was more than a fling. He was temptation made flesh, a man whose pull she never truly escaped. Even at 78, when she spoke of him, there was a flicker in her eyes that betrayed it all. Then came Paul Newman. If Burt Reynolds was fire, Paul Newman was ice. Cool, controlled, devastatingly magnetic. Sally worked with him on the 1981 drama Absence of Malice, and she admitted the attraction was immediate, almost overwhelming. His famous blue eyes were more dangerous than any kiss. On screen, Newman played a man fighting to keep his reputation intact. Off-screen, he carried an aura that made people stop in their tracks. Sally confessed she sometimes found herself staring across the table during filming, fighting the urge to lean forward to close the gap between them. What made Newman so irresistible wasn't wildness or flamboyance, it was restraint. He had a way of holding himself back that made every glance feel like an invitation, a dangerous, silent dare. Paul Newman was the dream standing right in front of me, Sally once said, and you can almost hear the sigh in her voice, the recognition that some desires were meant to stay unfulfilled. Newman was famously devoted to his wife, Joanne Woodward, and that devotion only added to his allure. It was forbidden, impossible, yet tantalizing precisely because it couldn't happen. For Sally, Newman represented the fantasy that lingers just out of reach, a reminder that sometimes the dreams we don't act on are the ones that burn the brightest. But Sally's list wasn't just filled with leading men who smoldered. One of her most surprising confessions was about Robin Williams, her co-star in Mrs. Doubtfire. To the world, Robin was the clown, the manic genius who could turn any moment into comedy. But to Sally, that chaos carried a different kind of temptation. On set, Robin made her laugh until she cried. He shifted characters with a flick of his voice, transforming from absurd to tender in seconds. And in that unpredictability, Sally saw something electric, something that stirred her in ways she hadn't expected. She admitted she fantasized about what it would feel like to channel all that manic energy into intimacy. But there was another side to Robin, the quiet, pensive stillness he sometimes carried when the cameras stopped. Sally once confessed, "If he ever leaned in, I would have let him sweep me away." For her, it wasn't just the laughter. It was the sudden drop into silence, the flicker of vulnerability that made him irresistible. Robin Williams wasn't polished like Paul Newman, and he wasn't a rogue like Burt Reynolds. He was a wildfire, unpredictable, uncontrollable, and unforgettable. And Sally Field, America's sweetheart, admitted that she wouldn't have minded getting burned. Sally Field never acted alongside Clint Eastwood. They never shared a set, never traded lines under studio lights. But in her confession, she admitted she didn't need to. Clint was the kind of man who could seduce from across the room without saying a single word. The tall frame, the squinting eyes, the half-smile that looked more like a challenge than a greeting. Clint Eastwood embodied the fantasy of dangerous quiet. He didn't have to chase anyone. He simply had to exist. Sally revealed that she sometimes imagined what it would feel like if Clint crooked his finger toward her, wordless, commanding. "I'd have followed without a script," she said. Unlike Burt Reynolds or Robin Williams, Clint wasn't playful. His attraction was about control, about stillness that masked a storm. Sally admitted the fantasy alone was powerful enough to make her blush. Clint was the man she didn't have to know personally. His image alone was enough to fuel the kind of daydreams she normally kept locked away. And maybe that's what made her confession about Eastwood so raw. He was proof that fantasy doesn't always need reality to ignite. Sometimes the most dangerous desires live entirely in the imagination. Then came Dustin Hoffman. Sally described him not as a dream or a fantasy, but as a firebrand. Unpredictable, obsessive, and intense. She worked with Hoffman in the same Hollywood circles during the 70s and 80s, and though they never became a public item, his presence was unforgettable. Hoffman's reputation as a method actor meant he threw himself fully into roles, sometimes to the point of making his co-stars uncomfortable. But Sally admitted that very intensity was what drew her in. "He could expose you just by looking at you," she confessed. It wasn't a soft kind of attraction. It was raw, almost unnerving. She explained that being around Hoffman was like bracing yourself for impact. You never knew if the energy would crash over you in anger, in laughter, or in desire. And that unpredictability, that constant edge of what comes next, was as thrilling as it was dangerous. Sally said half of what she felt for him was admiration, and half of it was lust. Together, that mix was combustible. Perhaps the most surprising name on Sally's list was Gregory Peck. By the time Sally was rising in Hollywood, Peck was already a legend. Tall, distinguished, and forever remembered as Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird. To most of the world, Peck represented dignity, morality, and honor. But to Sally, all that dignity was its own kind of seduction. She admitted, almost shyly, he could have ordered coffee, and I'd have been ready to swear eternal loyalty. His voice, his stillness, his presence were overwhelming. Unlike Bert or Robin, Gregory Peck didn't need charm or humor. His authority was enough. Sally described him as a monument of desire, a man whose gravity pulled you in whether you wanted it to or not. For her, the fantasy wasn't about playful romance or passionate fire. It was about surrender, total, unquestioning surrender to a man whose aura filled every space he entered. In naming him, Sally made it clear that desire wears many forms. Sometimes it's chaos, sometimes it's laughter, sometimes it's dangerous, and sometimes it's the steady, immovable strength of a man who never has to ask twice. Here's where things get even more intriguing. Publicly, Sally only revealed 7 names: Garner, Reynolds, Newman, Williams, Eastwood, Hoffman, and Peck. But then, almost as an afterthought, she admitted there were more. She hinted at 2 men whose names she never spoke aloud. Why hold back after revealing so much? That question has fueled endless speculation. Some argue she was protecting reputations. Others think the names were too controversial or perhaps too personal to share. And Sally herself, with that sly smile she's known for, left it hanging in the air. Let's just say there are 2 I'm keeping to myself. Fans immediately began guessing. Could it have been Marlon Brando, whose raw, almost animal magnetism had haunted Hollywood for decades? Brando was notorious for his conquests, his unrelenting charm, and his turbulent personal life. It wouldn't be far-fetched to imagine Sally falling under his spell, even from a distance. Or maybe it was Harrison Ford, the rugged adventurer who conquered the world as Han Solo and Indiana Jones. Ford had the same kind of unshakable presence as Peck, mixed with the mischievous grin of Reynolds. To many, he seemed like the perfect candidate for Sally's hidden confession. The point is, we may never know. And perhaps that was Sally's intention all along. By leaving 2 names unspoken, she created the perfect loop of mystery, ensuring her confession would live on in speculation and debate. Who were the missing 2? The answer will likely never be revealed, but the guessing game is part of the fun. Sally gave the world just enough to blush over, and just enough to argue about in living rooms, online forums, and fan circles everywhere. At first glance, Sally's confession feels like gossip, a juicy Hollywood tidbit meant to stir up headlines. But when you step back, it becomes something more important. What Sally Field did at 78 wasn't about scandal, it was about honesty. She reminded the world that desire doesn't fade with age, that women don't stop fantasizing, laughing, or longing simply because society says they should. By naming names, and by leaving a few unsaid, she gave herself permission to own her truth without shame. Hollywood has always tried to put women in boxes. The ingenue, the mother, the fading star. Sally broke out of every box they ever tried to trap her in, both in her career and now in her personal revelations. She showed us that you can be America's sweetheart and still be mischievous, bold, and unfiltered. Her confession wasn't just about 9 men, it was about reclaiming the narrative of her own life. And in doing so, she gave us permission to laugh, to blush, and to imagine right along with her. So here's the question. Does Sally Field's shocking confession change the way you see her? Or does it only make her more real, more human than ever before? Maybe she's no longer just the sweet girl next door, but the woman who dared to admit what most people only think about in private. Either way, her honesty has sparked a conversation that won't be forgotten anytime soon. Now it's your turn. Who do you think the 2 missing names were? Drop your guesses below, and let's see if we can solve Sally's final Hollywood mystery. But perhaps the most tantalizing part of her confession was not the names she gave us, but the 2 she chose to keep hidden. That dangling mystery became a story of its own, sparking endless speculation and commentary. It was as if Sally knew exactly how to stir a pot, how to give people just enough to talk about while keeping the juiciest morsels locked away. And maybe that's why, even after decades in the spotlight, she still knows how to command attention. Because here's the truth. Sally Field didn't just give us a list. She gave us permission. Permission to laugh, to blush, to admit that even the icons we place on pedestals have private, very human desires. For so long, Hollywood has demanded perfection, that women especially should remain untouchable, angelic, immune to the messiness of lust. Sally shattered that illusion with a smile and a wink. It's easy to imagine her at 78, still radiant, still sharp, leaning forward in her chair and saying, "You know what? Why not tell the truth?" That's the energy that made this confession so viral. It wasn't about scandal for scandal's sake. It was about the joy of honesty, about refusing to shrink just because society thinks age means silence. And let's not forget the ripple effect. Younger actresses, women still in the thick of Hollywood's pressure, have long looked to Sally Field as proof that you can carve your own path. Now, she's shown them something else. You can own your desires, your fantasies, even your regrets, without shame. By naming names, James Garner, Burt Reynolds, Paul Newman, Robin Williams, Clint Eastwood, Dustin Hoffman, Gregory Peck, she didn't just reveal crushes, she revealed power. The power of owning your truth in a world that constantly tells women to keep quiet. And those missing two names, they've already become legend. Were they men too powerful to mention, or men whose connection to her was more personal than the public could ever know? Some speculate they were contemporaries she worked with but never acknowledged. Others believe they were icons like Marlon Brando or Harrison Ford, names too obvious, too dangerous, too irresistible to confirm. By leaving them unsaid, Sally left us with something even better than answers: curiosity. And curiosity is the fuel of stories that live forever. In the end, Sally Field's confession isn't really about who she wanted to sleep with. It's about reclaiming her narrative, about refusing to let Hollywood or age or anyone else dictate what she can or cannot say. At 78, she's still teaching us lessons, not through characters on screen, but through her own unapologetic truth. So maybe the real shock isn't that she admitted her fantasies. Maybe the real shock is how liberating it feels to hear them. Sally reminded us that desire has no expiration date, that honesty can be mischievous and playful, and that even the most beloved icons are gloriously, beautifully human. And that's the story people won't stop talking about. Not just Sally Field, the actress, not just Sally Field, America's sweetheart, but Sally Field, the woman bold enough to make